All right, guys. So we're going to talk about our next chapter, which is chapter 10. This unit's also going to include chapter 11. It's land use and agriculture. So you have your learning targets here. We're not going to cover them. You guys can read them, understand them. They're in your packet. The whole chapter 10 is going to talk about land use and management of our public and private lands. When we talk about land management, we have three main things that we talk about. We have the tragedy of the commons, externalities, and maximum sustained yield. And I apologize, guys, I'm still fighting through a cold, so I'm going to do my best with this. Hopefully it works out. All right, so our first thing that we have is the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons, it shows up on the AP exam, maybe not directly linked to the tragedy of the commons, but it talks about that in one way or another just about every year with it. So it's a pretty important thing. You guys can read this definition. We're going to just basically talk about what the tragedy of the commons is all about. It was first brought about by Garrett Hardin in an essay he wrote. He talked about how if you have a common resource, it inevitably gets destroyed because of overuse, because nobody really has any direct link to the ownership or any care for that common resource. So on Moodle, this PowerPoint's going to be linked on there. This is a video from YouTube. You guys need to watch that video. Again, very good explanation of it. Gets into a little bit of externalities as well. So when you guys get onto Moodle, watch that video, click on it. If you just Google Tragedy of the Commons Learn Library, you guys can also just YouTube it right now and get in from there. As you can see, I got too close to the link and it started opening up anyway. All right, so basically what the Tragedy of the Commons is, you have a shared common resource. In this case, it's a pasture. Pasture is nothing more than a grassy field that the livestock graze on. So everybody has equal access to that pasture. So let's say that these blue sheep here were from Farmer Blue. Right? The green sheep are going to be from Farmer Green, and we'll paint in a yellow sheep to make Farmer Yellow. All three of these farmers have equal access to this shared resource, but none of the three own it. It's public land. Think back to the medieval days where the tenant farmers were able to graze their land on the common pastures. They gave their tribute then to the king, and everybody was happy. So that's what's happening here. It doesn't have to be, medieval days. It's, currently happening too with our common resources. They're just resources that are not owned by anybody, but can be used by all. So in this case, again, it's the field. All three of these farmers are gaining direct benefit from the field. They're all grazing their sheep. Their sheep are living. They're going to have sources of wool, sources of food whenever they butcher the sheep, all of those things. Now, since none of them own it, they're also not absorbing any of the harm done to it. These sheep are going to be grazing and doing harm to the land. They're getting all the benefit, none of the harm. So Farmer Yellow decides, hey, I'm making, $100 a year off my sheep. Why not put another one on the field and make $200 a year? So Farmer Yellow brings in a second sheep. He's getting, again, all the benefit, none of the harm. Farmer Blue thinks the same thing. Hey, I can make $200, why not? So he brings in an extra sheep. Farmer Green, he doesn't bring in an extra sheep. He's a little bit behind the times, so he just has his one sheep there. Now, yellow and blue, they're making double the money as what green is. They're getting all the benefit again, none of the harm. Farmer Green still isn't absorbing any of the harm, still isn't getting, or is still getting benefit rather. So his next year, he decides, hey, I'm going to bring in 2 extra sheep. So now he's going to have 3 sheep here. Farmer Yellow says, hey, I'm going to add an extra sheep to it. And why not add a second one while I'm at it? Farmer Blue, same deal. So now the farmers keep adding sheep because they're getting direct benefit from adding those sheep. They're getting increased wool production, they're getting increased food production, all of those other things. So they're getting all the benefit, but none of them are paying to manage that field. And as you can see, the field went from being green and lush to being a little bit trampled down to now being overgrazed and to the point of no return. So then the following year, none of them would be able to graze sheep. So they were all receiving all the benefit, but nobody was taking responsibility for the common resource. So inevitably that common resource gets destroyed. We see this in nature all the time. We can see it with our oceans and the fish populations in them. More and more people go out to fish commercially, more and more fish are harvested. Eventually, the fish in the ocean dwindle, and we don't have that resource anymore. We see it with pollution in the air, all of those things. Again, everybody's receiving equal benefit from using those resources, but nobody's absorbing the direct cost of the harm they're doing to it. So it's a shared harm, but a individual benefit for it. So because of that, everybody's looked out for their own self-interest, and inevitably that common resource is destroyed. You see that in like public bathrooms and parking lots. My wife, she yells at me all the time because I don't park my truck very well. I'm always kind of crooked or over the line just a little bit. And I always just say, it's all right. I'm just going to go into the store anyway. Well, that's abusing a common resource. Everybody has access to that parking lot. Everybody has equal access to it, but nobody really shares the cost of somebody parking outside the lines. If I'm taking up a spot in a quarter, now somebody else can't use that spot beside me. So again, everybody's sharing it, everybody's getting equal. If everybody ends up taking a spot in a quarter, now there's 100 less spots across the parking lot for people to use. That's what the tragedy of the commons is all about. Now, externalities is another important part of this. Externalities are the costs or benefits of a good or services not included in the purchase price. So let's say that we're buying those stupid pop sockets that people put on the back of their phones. Those little buttons that kind of pop out and they hold your phone and all that stupid stuff. I don't have one, as you can tell. I think they're dumb. I think they're a waste of money. But let's say that in the production of those pop sockets, the company decides to make a factory in Malaysia, for instance. All the Malaysian people are going to be absorbing the harm associated with that factory being there. The increased air pollution, increased water pollution, all of those harms associated with the factory. But they're not going to get money back from the company for that company being there. A few people might have jobs there, but the whole country as a whole, or that local area as a whole, aren't going to benefit from that product being produced there. They're gaining all the harm and all that negative aspect of it, but they're not really getting anything in return for it. So when the company makes the pop socket, they're going to charge $10 for it. All right, that is a price that they set that they can be profitable at, but it doesn't include all the harm associated with that. If we look at the people in Malaysia, we may have increased respiratory problems because now the air is much more polluted. So people with asthma, people with emphysema, they're going to have a lot harder time breathing. They're going to go to the doctor more frequently, use more medicines, all of those things. So now let's say that costs that community $1 million over the course of a year. So now that's $1 million added in. Let's say that the factory dumped and had a chemical spill in the water that was the drinking water for everybody. So they had to bring in bottled water for people to drink. Let's say that cost the local government $500,000. All of these costs add up, but it's not changing the price of that pop socket cost. So that company is doing all that harm to the environment, but they're not including that environmental harm into the cost of their product. That's what an externality is. You have this false sense of that product being a cheap product, when in fact it's doing a lot of environmental harm and causing a lot of problems. So the price of it really should be $20, $25 if you're including in the environmental harm to it. Those are the externalities that give people a false sense of what value products have. Now they could be good externalities too. For instance, you could have a farmer in a area. They're going to be farming, they're going to be producing food for the country. There's also other benefits of those farms as well. You have more bees around to pollinate. You have more biodiversity. You have, some people might think driving through cornfields is pretty. During the fall time, whenever the leaves are changing and you see the golden wheat flowing through the fields. Those are positive externalities. They're benefiting that aren't also included into the price of that good or service. From an environmental standpoint, we tend to focus on the negative externalities because those are the ones that we see environmental harm caused from them without people realizing it. You're buying really, really cheap products because they're made in countries that don't have the pollution control standards. So everybody thinks that they're not really doing much damage by buying those throwaway goods, but they're really creating a lot of pollution because of that. Those are those negative externalities that we really need to look at fixing because that's doing a lot of environmental damage. They're shipping those cheap products, the little quarter machines that they have at the grocery store that have those little bubbles with the toys in them. those things, they're produced massively on grand scales. They're usually produced in countries like China or Indonesia, places that don't have pollution control standards like we do in America. They were produced those in America. Those pollution control standards kind of cause them to take those externalities into the cost of the product. So where it might take a penny for them to make it in China or Malaysia or Indonesia, it might cost 50 cents for them to make those little products in America, because now the companies are being more held accountable for their pollution. So those externalities are going to come into the cost of the good. When they're not included in the cost of the good, people again have a false sense of security in that product is not being a very environmentally damaging or a very environmentally harmful product. All right, so again, this is the pop socket example. You guys can read through that and include that into your idea about what externalities are all about. Now, positive externalities. A drive-in movie theater, that opens next door. All right, when we have our house, let's say that my house was worth, I have a really crappy rundown house, so this isn't going to be my house by any means, but let's say that my house was worth $275,000. Again, definitely not my house. My house is worth a fraction of that. So that $275,000 house that we have, a drive-in movie theater opens up next door. All right, it's great. I get to watch free movies every night for free. I tune my radio in and I watch and listen to all these brand new movies, never have to pay $1 for it. So I'm getting direct benefit from that movie theater being there. I have the enjoyment of being able to watch movies anytime I want to. However, as time goes on, I start realizing, the grass isn't always greener on the other side. Now that light coming from the drive-in every single night starts to creep into my windows, and I start to realize, hey, I'm having a lot of hard time sleeping. My kids are having trouble sleeping. My dogs are barking all the time every time a car drives by. All those different things. So I start to then see people not wanting to buy my house. Let's say that it's up for sale and my listing price was $275,000. That drive-in movie theater goes by. Now people don't want to buy it because they're realizing, I'm talking up the fact that they can watch movies for free every night, but they're also realizing that they have these negatives coming in from the light pollution. They have, all of these different traffic problems now that never were there. Some of the people come and visit the house right as the movie theater was starting up. So they realize, hey, my kids aren't going to be able to ride their bikes on the streets because there's way too many people flying here to watch the movies. Also, the people at the movie theater don't know that you exist. So when they're walking to the concession stand and when they're leaving the area, they're throwing their cups out of their car, they're landing in your yard. So now my property value is no longer $275,000. It might go down to $230,000. Right? So I have this positive externality of being able to watch all these free movies, but I have all these other negative externalities that are going to be, really affecting me. So the drive-in movie opening next door, I thought it was a great thing originally, but the more I look at it, the more negatives there are with it, and it wasn't included into the original cost that they proposed to the community. The drive-in opened up and they said, hey, we're going to bring in tax money, we're going to do all this stuff, but they didn't really tell you that your property values are going to go down. You're going to lose the ability to have kids riding bikes. There's going to be more pollution, more, people throwing garbage everywhere, all those things. Now, the last of the things talking about land use and management is the theory of maximum sustained yield. And again, theory, it's not a set number. It fluctuates from time to time, and it's hard to estimate. So it's a case-by-case study, and it also is going to vary greatly as you're looking case to case. So what it is, it's the maximum amount of resource, and it has to be a renewable resource because it has to be able to replace itself. It's the maximum amount of a resource that you can harvest without compromising future availability. Now that sounds an awful lot like carrying capacity, and to a point, it's basically the same thing. But with carrying capacity, it wasn't the amount we could harvest, it was the amount we could support without compromising future ecosystem health. With maximum sustained yield, now we're talking about a yield. We're talking about harvesting something out. So it could be for anything from wildflowers that you're picking to deer that you're shooting and harvesting during hunting season. It doesn't matter. So that harvest should be sustainable. It should be able to be the same amount every single year, and every single year the amount of the population doesn't change either. So we had that maximum sustained yield. Really, really challenging to count and calculate, but you can estimate it fairly easily. And the way that you estimate it fairly easily is you want to look at where the population size is growing at its maximum potential. So where it's growing the fastest. So if we look at a true population curve, again, we have that exponential growth that starts out. However, we have our carrying capacity line here with the dotted line. That carrying capacity is the maximum population you can support indefinitely. So we have that quick growth, that exponential growth that starts, but then we get to a point where it shifts from being exponential and it starts to approach that carrying capacity and levels out. That point at which it shifts, that's going to be its point of maximum growth. So it's going to grow slow through here, fastest through here, and then slow back down here again. All right, where we intersect our line here and where we go from being, growing, seeing improved faster growth to seeing slower declining growth rates, that's where our maximum sustained yield is at. And it's usually about half of what the carrying capacity is. That's the general rule of thumb. If you take away half of what the carrying capacity, let's say that in a forest by our house, there's a 450 deer carrying capacity, all right, for that plot of woods. If we take that and cut it in half and we end up with 225, if we harvest 225 deer every year, that shouldn't impact our number. The thought is those 225 that are left are going to be able to reproduce and get back to that carrying capacity. If I continually take away just half of my carrying capacity, natural reproduction should replace those. However, that natural reproduction is a very, very hard thing to predict because you're assuming they're going to find mates. You're assuming there's going to be enough of a sex ratio that allows for males and females to be equally distributed. So you're assuming that all those things are going to be in perfect unison and perfect harmony. So you're assuming by taking half the carrying capacity away, you're just going to replace them in the population. It doesn't always happen, and usually there's that time lag with it that we don't know if it was true and accurate until a couple generations have passed. And in some cases, if we're over harvesting, say that our maximum sustained yield isn't 225 and it's 175, then instead, if we've been harvesting deer at 225, now we're harvesting 50 extra deer every year. It doesn't take very long for that 450 deer population to crash down to nothing because we take 50 extra deer out every year. It may take us 4 or 5 years to realize that, hey, we're over harvesting and our maximum sustained yield is lower than what that half carrying capacity is. But general rule of thumb, if you pick half of the carrying capacity, you're usually fairly accurate with it and fairly reliable results from it. Doesn't mean it always is that way. We can see that crashing if that's the case. And again, that's what this is showing here. Slow growth, fastest growth, slow growth. If we harvest and pick that maximum sustained yield where growth is the fastest, that's when we can assume that they're going to replace themselves in the population by natural mating. All right, I think we're going to stop there with the first video. That's going to give us an idea of those first three things. We have a couple labs we're going to do, a couple activities we're going to do, then we'll move into the next set of videos with it. So I hope that all went well, and somebody in the comments section of the last video said we needed more poison dart frogs and salamanders, so I put a poison dart frog picture in there for you. Hopefully I'll get a positive comment about including that in there with us. All right, so look forward to the next couple of videos, and we'll keep on moving through the chapter here.